Dishmaya, Yom Rishon, Parsha MATOS MASEH, Tovshin Pei. Parsha starts off talking about the inyan of Nedarim. And it was makes a neder, he has to keep it. Whatever he said, that obligates him for a neder. And then there is a significant Torah deals at length with what happens if a woman makes a neder. In basically three capacities. She can make it as a daughter, who's a naira, who's a 12-year-old daughter, who is legally entitled and eligible to make a binding vow. The law is that the vow is binding, but her father is entitled to nullify her vow. And if she gets engaged, then her husband and her father together are entitled to nullify her vow. And if she gets fully married, her husband is entitled fully to nullify her vow. And if she thereafter gets divorced or widowed, then she alone becomes re-entitled to nullify her. No one can nullify her vows. They're not subject to anyone. And question is, why is the Torah choosing this particular location and point to expand on these laws? So the Das Kenim asked the question: why is the Parsha of Nedarim? Why is the inyan of vows, the whole sugi of vows? Why is this presented here? And the answer is because it's a continuation of the sacrificial order that we read in the previous portion of Pinchas, which talked all about the communal sacrifices that are brought, and then it said these are the communal sacrifices you bring every day or on the festivals, etc. And these are in addition to the private undertakings that a person can himself obligate himself. Apart from all the individual sacrifices that a person can bring. Then, subject to that, following that, the Torah says, okay, what happens if a person does make himself an individual vow? And the Torah was talking, perhaps the classic vow is a vow that I'm going to bring a sacrifice. But there could also be vows that are very strongly connected, where he says, no, I'm going to bring a sacrifice, but I'm going to discipline myself. I'm going to render something that I have no permission whatsoever to derive any benefit from it. I'm going to circumspect my entitlement to enjoyment of a particular food, or going to a particular place, or doing a particular activity. I can take a vow that I'm not going to partake of that particular activity or that particular pleasure, which is not a classic bringing a sacrifice, but it's very strongly connected to bring a sacrifice. So that answers perhaps the connection, but it still raises two questions. First of all, if this is the connection from the previous portion, I've already made a bracha, so why is this not appear in the previous portion of Pinchas? Why do we wait? Why do we make a break and the portion of Pinchas? Now it's a new portion, MATOS MASEH. Now we're going to deal with individual vows. Second question, why does the Torah expand so much on the idea of a woman making a vow and the entitlement of the husband or father to nullify her vow? And thirdly, what's the context? What comes after this? Now we have something that seems to be unrelated. We go sort of back into the narrative. The Pinchas had started with the killing of the Midianite, that Yisrael had been promiscuous with the Midianite women, and that this had brought them to, and the Moabite women, this had brought them to idolatry. And Pinchas had taken the law into his own hands and had acted as a zealot, and thereby had stopped the Magif, or the plague, that was raging in Klal Yisrael. And then the Torah carried on talking about counting Klal Yisrael and then the sacrifices they have to bring every day. And now we're coming back to actually realize and execute Hashem's instruction that was given immediately subsequent to the plague. Hashem said, take vengeance on Midian. And what is vengeance? And this is what happens now. Hashem says, now is the time for the execution of that instruction. Now take vengeance on Klal Yisrael. So we've gone through all the Nedarim, we've gone through all the sacrifices. Now Hashem comes back and says, okay, now is the time, Moshe, for you to instruct Klal Yisrael to enact this war of revenge. Nekoim nikmas b'nei Yisrael. Achar te'osef el amecho. And also Moshe is told here, ironically, tragically, sadly, after this battle has been fought, te'osef el amecho, you will be gathered into your people. In other words, after this, Moshe Rabbeinu, you no longer will be living, you'll no longer be the leader of Klal Yisrael, you'll no longer be living. The question is, why does there seem to be this connection? I think we spoke about it last week in Pinchas, so we'll mention it again here because it ties in, it's Hashem, nicely with the theme. But so Moshe Rabbeinu instructs Klal Yisrael, you should arrange an army to fight Midian, 1,000 from each tribe, and Moshe Rabbeinu sends them 12,000 altogether, and Pinchas and the holy implements, instruments, the tzitz, the oroin, these the holy ark. Pinchas brings them to accompany with him on this war, and there's going to be various explanations as to two questions. Why did Moshe himself not do it? Why did he not himself take responsibility for waging this war? Hashem instructed him, you should do it. And Moshe Rabbeinu instructs Pinchas to do it. So, and why Pinchas? Why not Elazar? Why not someone else? And Rashi also brings that that when Klal Yisrael went into war, they arranged themselves into battalions. This was done by Yimosru unwillingly, because this teaches us how beloved are the leaders of Yisrael. That Yisrael, the whole time when they had Moshe as the leader, they were complaining, but when it came to it, they were told, now this is going to be the ultimate final act of Moshe Rabbeinu as leader of Yisrael. After this, he's going to have to leave this world. Klal Yisrael were very reluctant to engage in this battle by Moshe. They had to be forced into it. And Pinchas. So Rashi says, why did Pinchas go? So Rashi brings two answers. One answer, because Pinchas started it. This really was his campaign. When did he start it? When he killed Cosby. Cosby was the Midianite woman who was having an incestuous relation with Zimri from Yisrael. And Pinchas came zealously and pierced both of them with the spear, fatally killing them ultimately. And therefore this was the start, says Rashi, this was really figuratively, or actually the start of the campaign of revenge against Midian. So Pinchas, having initiated this campaign, it is appropriate that he should be the one to continue it. That's the first answer Rashi gives as to why Pinchas was given, was placed as, let's say, general in command of this battle. Second answer, Rashi gives a different answer, because Pinchas had himself a particular gripe, a particular personal matter that made it appropriate for him to be waging this war. What was this personal matter, Pinchas? Pinchas descended, we know, from Elazar. Elazar was his father, who was the son of Aaron, but also Elazar had taken a wife from Putiel, which was the family of Yosef, and also within that family were members of the family of Yosef, like we said. And Yosef here had an outstanding issue against Midian. Yosef and Midian. We don't really find much to do with Yosef, except there's one mention Rashi brings of Yosef and Midian, that Hamidiani, when Yosef was sold into slavery by his brothers, he was sold to Yishmaelim, and then he was sold a number of times, he was sold then to Midianim. And the Midianim sold him into slavery into Egypt. And says Rashi, Pinchas came to avenge that particular sale. The sale that the Midianim had sold Yosef, a great grandfather of Pinchas, through some particular lineage. Pinchas was coming to avenge that against the Midianim. The Midianim had sold Yosef to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, and Pinchas now, it seems it was appropriate for Pinchas to avenge that act. And we have to understand what was the vengeance and why Pinchas. The Midianim did what they do. That's what they do. You'd expect the Midianim who've been sold a slave by the Ishmaelim that they're going to politely return them to Yisrael. Nevertheless, it seems to be that Pinchas there is an issue of avenging this. The Pinchas is particularly is the appropriate party to execute this. And he conducts the war. They fight against Midian, and they kill everyone. They kill all the males. We're going to get later into who exactly was killed and when and why. But we're just going to do the initial part of it. The Malchei Midian hargu al chalehem. They killed the kings of Midian, and there were 5 of them. Evi, Rechem, Tzur, Churves, Reva. Chameshes Malchei Midian. These were the 5 kings of Midian. And also Bilam, they also killed Bechorev. So there's going to be quite a bit about that. So Rashi comments straight away. The Pasuk gives us a list of the 5 kings of Midian, and then it tells us, it summarizes, Chameshes Malchei Midian, these were the 5 kings of Midian. Says Rashi, we don't need maths, the Torah, to do the extra maths for us. We know there are 5 people on this list, so we know these are 5 kings of Midian. So what's it telling us? Says Rashi to tell us a message that they were all equally culpable in the plot, in the that they had conspired in this conspiracy against a spiritual conspiracy against Yisrael. They were all equally culpable and equally involved, all equally compliances. Why? Because says Rashi, Lamuz Chameshes, Shavu Kulam, they're all equal. And therefore they're all equal in culpability, they're all equal in liability, therefore they're all equally slain. What is that? The question is, what is the significance of that fact? That the fact that they are all equally liable. Why is that so important to us? And then Rashi continues, seemingly unrelated piece. Says Rashi, Bilam was also there. The Pasuk also, and it seems to be that's how Rashi says it. The Pasuk says he killed the 5 kings of Midian, and Bilam also, they killed Bechorev by the sword. And Rashi says, Bilam, what was he doing there? He went to get reward because his counsel to Balak had resulted in this conspiracy, this evil plot of Balak to make Yisrael sin through the daughters of Moav and Midian in adultery and in idol worship. And as a result of that, that was Bilam's idea. And as a result of that, there had been 24,000 of Yisrael that had been fallen in the plague. So Bilam was now going to receive his due payment. He had been instructed to curse Klal Yisrael, and he had been partially successful to the extent that as 24,000 souls of Yisrael had perished in the plague. So Bilam is now going to receive payment for that. And Rashi sort of brings in the Sifri, which is sort of very... It's somewhat vague what it's coming actually to say. He went from Midian towards Yisrael, and he gave them an Eitzara'ah. He gave Yisrael, it seems, a poor advice. What was the advice? He said to Yisrael, don't try and fight against Midian. Why? Because you're not capable. Because when you were 600,000, when you were at your full strength, you were unable to survive the onslaught, which refers to when they had enticed Klal Yisrael, they had failed to maintain their moral standards. Similarly now, it seems you're also going to be incapable, because now you're only 12,000. That's your whole army. You're certainly not going to be capable of defeating Midian. Which is interesting. He's comparing the spiritual incapacity of Yisrael against Midian now to their warring capacity. And saying you're also going to be incapable of waging a normal war. And so why are you coming to fight? And Rashi cryptically sort of finishes off. As a result of that counsel that Bilam gave, they gave him full reward and did not in any way deprive him. And Rashi brings, how did they slay Bilam? Bacherev, by the sword. Rashi says that's significant. Why? It's like measure for measure. Bilam came, says Rashi, and sort of exchanged his particular expertise with theirs. Why? Because Klal Yisrael, essentially, their expertise, their primary weapon is that of prayer. They're not violent people. they flourish and thrive and depend on prayer, the power of prayer primarily. And Bilam came against Israel. He usurped also the power of the oral power of a curse, which is taking the same strength, that of speech. And he used that against Israel. And therefore, correspondingly, Israel, in seeking revenge against Bilam, they attacked him with his, primarily. The nations of the world primarily are guided by and rely on the sword, figuratively. Therefore, they slew Bilam by the sword. Therefore, it was appropriate. And in this context, we'll see. Let's just finish off the Psukim. And they slew everyone. They were successful in this campaign, Klal Yisrael, and they took all the spoil and brought it back to Moshe and Aaron. Now, the next piece is afterwards. Let's see the Targum, who says about Bilam. Describes in great graphic detail the final encounter between Bilam and Pinchas. So Rashi brings, notable to note, Rashi brings that Pinchas took the Klei HaKodesh, the holy implements, and because Bilam used to use witchcraft to enable him to actually fly in the air, as were also. So Pinchas used to, like we said, so when Bilam was using this witchcraft to enable him to float in the air and the other kings with him, so what Pinchas did was he showed them the tzitz, and the Shem Hashem on the sort of the head plate had the name of Hashem inscribed on it, and Pinchas just showed that to Bilam, and he thereby fell from his flying carpet. And they were all killed that way. That's how Pinchas defeated them. The Targum brings a slightly different narrative. That when Bilam brings it in interesting detail, dramatic, interesting detail. When Bilam saw Pinchas chasing after him, so what did Bilam do? It's the Targum Yonason. He, through witchcraft, he was able to float, to make himself fly in the air. So Pinchas did the same, according to the Targum. Pinchas said the holy name of Hashem, and he also was able to fly in the air. And he caught up with Bilam, took hold of his head, and withdrew his sword to slay him. And Pinchas and Bilam opened his mouth and started pleading for his life, pleading for mercy, and said to Pinchas, he promised him, if you will spare my life, I swear that all my days I will never ever again curse your people. And Pinchas retorted to him, this is not, I'm not accepting this. Because you are yourself, Lovan Orami, you wish to destroy Yaakov, our father, and then you again went down to Mitzrayim to deal with us through Paray. You instructed Paray to wipe us out in Mitzrayim. And then you also enticed Amalek to fight against Israel. Then finally you were part of this conspiracy to curse Am Yisrael. And since you saw that even the cursing was unsuccessful, so you decided to give this deathly advice to Balak to make Klal Yisrael sin and to fall in the plague. And therefore, there is no way in which whatsoever that your life can be spared. You caused the downfall, the slaying of 24,000 of Klal Yisrael. Therefore, there is no possibility whatsoever of maintaining your life, sustaining your life. He withdrew his sword, Pinchas, and slayed Bilam. And the question is, why was Pinchas even entering into a particular negotiation or discussion? There's no question whatsoever. You're going to believe Bilam, who says, yeah, from now on I'm going to be a good boy. You're holding a sword over him, you're threatening to kill him. And Bilam says, have mercy on me. I'll be a good boy from now on. And Pinchas restored, I can't really trust you. You've been so naughty so many times, you can no longer be trusted. There's nothing to talk about. What possible grounds might Pinchas have entertained for sparing the life of the evil Bilam? He's really the archetype, the ultimate embodiment of evil. If a person would have Hitler, in the middle of the Holocaust, and one would have him by the sword and be about to slay him, and he would plead for his life, I'm never going to do anymore, I'm not going to gas any more Jews, I'm not going to murder any more wholesale Jews, millions of people. So you're going to believe him? You're going to cut his head off in an instant. So why is Pinchas sort of recounting history to prove that? No, there's no way, I'm afraid that your life can be spared. And the Das Kenim, the Rosh, brings that regarding Pinchas slain by the sword, that it was actually, it says Bechorev, the sword, referring to a particular sword. And what's the particular sword that's being referred to here? Says the Rosh. He says it's referring to the sword that Yaakov, when Yaakov was in Beis Lavan and they separated, ultimately Yaakov left, they had a fight when Lavan had chased after Yaakov, and then finally they made a pact. So Yaakov, it says the Rosh here, it's not in the Parsha, Yaakov took a sword, they made a sort of a pile of stones, which would signify that neither party will traverse this particular pile of stones that will be between their lands. Yaakov will no longer go into the land of Lavan, nor will Lavan traverse this path coming to Yaakov with any evil ill intent. And Yaakov placed a sword in this pile of stones as a very visible threat. Whoever will dare to incur into the other's territory, he will be liable to be killed by the sword. This is the sword when Bilam sort of illegally traversed this division that had been set up between them, so he's now liable to be killed by the sword. And more than that, the stones of the wall itself, of this pile of stones, they were the ones actually that executed this revenge. How? Because this was, Bilam was traveling on the donkey, and the donkey saw the angel and pushed to the side, trapping Bilam's leg against the wall. That was a stone. There was actually stone. There was really the stone, figuratively, says the Rosh, that was a stone of the wall, of the pile of stones, that had been the pact of the non-aggression pact between Bilam and Yaakov, which Bilam was now reneging on by coming with intent to curse Yisrael, and therefore he's liable to be stoned, so to speak, by these stones. And therefore, this was the initiation of that process of execution by stoning, which was completed by the sword. And this is an appropriate way, the way that execution has to be effected. Why? Because it says, Yad ha'edim tiyeh b'rishona. Always the witnesses should be the first ones to throw the first stone against the guilty, the guilty party, who is liable to be stoned. And here, therefore, the stones are the witnesses. They are the witnesses to the original promise, and they are the witnesses now to the breach of the promise. Therefore, they were the ones who initiated the actual stoning itself. That's what the Das Kenim says. That's what the Rosh says about the killing of Bilam. The Das Kenim, this will be the final point here. The Das Kenim says, he asks the question we mentioned: why did Moshe Rabbeinu himself not go to execute this war? He'd been instructed, you have to be the general, you have to be the one to take revenge against Midian. So why does Moshe himself not go? He sends other people. So he says two answers. First answer, says Das Kenim, is because Moshe Rabbeinu himself owed a debt of gratitude to Midian. He himself, when he was fleeing from Paroi, he had hid in Midian, and therefore it was inappropriate for Moshe Rabbeinu to himself be the one to exact revenge against Midian, who themselves had been his graceful saviors and hosts. And he brings, like people say, beer the shashas minei, leitishta afro, if you drank from a well, don't throw a stone into it. So Moshe Rabbeinu, that would be the ultimate in ingratitude. If he were now to wage this war of vengeance against Midian, and says Tosfos another answer, that no, it's not out of gratitude that Moshe Rabbeinu did not go, because Moshe Rabbeinu did not owe a debt of gratitude, because this was not the same Midian. This is a different Midian. There are two Midianim, the two Midians. This is not the same nation that Moshe Rabbeinu had sought refuge in. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu was entitled to morally wage the war. Nevertheless, why did Moshe Rabbeinu himself not do it? Because Pinchas, like Rashi says, he had initiated the mitzvah, and therefore it was appropriate for Pinchas to continue waging this war. And the question is, on the first answer of Tosfos. Tosfos says it's inappropriate for Moshe Rabbeinu to wage this war because he owes debt of gratitude for what Midian had done to him. So let me ask you a similar scenario. A person is thrown out of his family onto the street, and another family takes him in, and he lives with his family for a number of years, and they help him to put him back on his feet. He goes into the world, earns a profession, sets up a family, has a beautiful family, and then one day somebody comes in, perhaps a robber who was lacking funds, enters his house, and is seen by one of this person's families, and knowing that he's been caught, this robber then executes all the children in the family. And the only person that's left is the father of the family, who was actually the one, ironically, who had been offered refuge by this person turned nighttime robber. Would one say this family, this former head of a family, who's now lost all his family to his former host, he owes a debt of gratitude? He should not report this person to the police. He should not seek that justice should be brought for this willful and murder of his whole family. Seems to be that this is misplaced sympathy and morality. It's over-moralizing. Moshe Rabbeinu, yes, there is a debt of gratitude. Under normal circumstances, it might be appropriate. But under these circumstances, where your host himself is turned against those most beloved and dear to you, and in the most malevolent, malicious manner, has brought about their spiritual and physical demise, emaciation. So you still owe a debt of gratitude? Is that still appropriate? It seems to be slightly exaggerated, misplaced morality. So that we have to understand as well. Okay, B'siyat Dishmaya, we're going to try and explain these points to construct the initiation of something of a narrative of what's going on. Okay, so we can suggest that let's start off with what is this whole concept of revenge in this context. And the word for revenge is nekama. So you have there, nekama. And we've explained a number of times, nekama, why does a person want to avenge someone? Reuven hits Shimon, he falls on the floor. Shimon, the first thing he wants to do, either that instant or at some later time, is to get his own back. And the nekama, we said, maybe is comprised of two words, nun, kon. What does nun mean? It says, Malchus Chom, Malchus Kol Ilomim, your kingdom is the ultimate kingdom forever. And then it says, that Hashem supports all those who fall. This is the prayer, the Psalm of Ashrei. And each verse starts with a different letter of the alphabet in order, except the letter Nun does not have its own verse. And the Gemara explains because that signifies Nefila, falling. Nun signifies often Nefila. As we've explained, for example, man is one person. You have many men, so what happens? It's called anoshim. Why is it not called ishim? Because one person, when he's an individual, he has all the significance and all the characteristics and traits of an individual. When you bring him together, so the group becomes the more dominant force. The individual recedes slightly more. Therefore, it's called anoshim. Nun is a lashon of nefila, of sort of becoming subordinate. So the person, individual, becomes subordinate within a group. That says anoshim, becomes the nun. Nefila. perhaps therefore, this is what Nekama really is about. Why does a person want to seek revenge? Because having fallen, their ego, their prestige, their whole self awareness, self-esteem has suffered. They've been humiliated, so they have to reassert their status. So that's done through revenge. Now I'm on top, now I've got one up against you. So you could say the word nekama is comprised of these two elements. Nun kam. Nun is nefila. After a fall, a nefila is a lotion of a fall, not foul. Then a person has an existential need to reassert themselves. That is kam. That means to rise up against, to reassert oneself, to reestablish oneself, to make oneself once more significant. So, if that is the concept of nekama, we can say this really is what is going on with Midian. That the revenge that is being exacted here is not necessarily directly specifically a revenge for what was done. There were two things were done to Yisrael. One is that they suffered a loss through the plague, but also they suffered a spiritual falling. That they sinned in promiscuous adultery, they sinned in idol worship, and therefore the spiritual level had been seriously, negatively compromised. And part of the revenge was to reassert their spiritual status. And according to that, we can understand perhaps a number of things. No particular order. For example, Moshe Rabbeinu. It says, once this war has been enacted, Moshe Rabbeinu, you can leave Klal Yisrael. You are going to be gathered into your people. And we asked, why is Moshe Rabbeinu's departure dependent and in tangent with the revenge against Midian? One could say, because that is also explained a number of times, that is the idea of Moshe Rabbeinu, in natural fact, leaving Klal Yisrael. That as long as we have the tzaddikim, Moshe, Aaron and Miriam, as the spiritual leaders of Yisrael, so they're responsible largely for helping Yisrael to attain and maintain spiritual heights. However, there also is a sort of, one might say, almost a dependence, spiritual dependence on the tzaddik. And there's perhaps a dynamic here of Yisrael coming into their own, achieving a spiritual independence, achieving the spiritual heights, so to speak. Moshe Rabbeinu is letting them go on their own, like a baby you let walk by itself, so you gradually take away the support. So Moshe Rabbeinu was like, and with Aaron and Miriam were there with the spiritual support system, and now, having been with Yisrael and inculcated them with the spiritual values necessary for them to survive the next thousands of years in Eretz Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu sort of departs and allows Yisrael to fend for themselves spiritually. This is the achat Yosef Lamecha. Once they had suffered this terrible spiritual setback in the form of sinning through Midian, so Hashem commands Moshe, you should help them to have revenge, and revenge means reassert their spiritual status. Once that has been achieved, then achat Yosef Lamecha, then finally, yes, Moshe Rabbeinu, you can take leave of Am Yisrael, and they will now be hopefully able to fend for themselves spiritually. And we said Moshe Rabbeinu does not go himself; he sends rather Pinchas. And Rashi asks, why Pinchas? And Rashi brought two reasons. A, because either Pinchas had started the war against Midian. That's the first reason. The second reason was Pinchas was avenging what had been done to, perpetrated against his illustrious grandfather Yosef by the Midianim. The Midianim had sold Yosef into slavery into Egypt, and Pinchas was avenging, because Pinchas derived partially from Yosef through Putiel, through Elazar, we explained, and therefore Pinchas was avenging that spiritual crime that had been perpetrated against Yosef. And we asked, what type of crime is that? What does that mean? So one could say like this. What are the two answers in Rashi? One could say they both are very much related to this notion of the spiritual war. That on the one hand, Rashi says this was Pinchas. He had started the avenging against Midian, and therefore he was the one that was appropriate, should conduct this war. The other explanation seems to say, no, it wasn't because of that. It was revenge of Yosef. It wasn't because of Pinchas. It wasn't that Pinchas had started the war. And what you could ask, what was wrong with the first answer? The first answer was Pinchas had started the war of revenge against Midian. So what's wrong with that? The second answer seems to say, no, Pinchas wasn't chosen because he had started the war. Pinchas was chosen for a different reason, to avenge his grandfather's, what his grandfather had suffered at the hands of Midian. So what are these two answers? One could suggest the following. That was Pinchas. Let's analyze for a moment. Let's close up on the act of Pinchas slaying Cosby, the Midianite woman. Pinchas came and slayed Zimri from Shimon at the time when they were engaged in this illicit, sinful act, promiscuous act. And Pinchas slayed Zimri and also slayed at the same time Cosby. The order was first he slayed, he was on the top it seems, Zimri, and then he pierced the body of Cosby. So you could say, what status does that act have of slaying Cosby? You could say one of two things. You could say, yes, it was an act of vengeance against Midian. But you could say, no, it was a more simple, straightforward. It was part of the act of stopping things. There was a plague going on because Bnei Yisrael themselves were engaged in this promiscuous, sinful activity. And Pinchas simply had to come along and put a stop to it. And that was the anger of Hashem. He had to actually stop this happening. And then, as part of bringing Klal Yisrael to their senses almost. So maybe the act of slaying Cosby was an act of just necessary to stop what was going on. Or maybe no. Maybe the act, that wasn't necessary. The act of slaying the Yisrael, Zimri, the act of slaying Zimri was enough to actually bring Yisrael to their senses. And what was done subsequently in slaying the Midianite woman, that was the initiation of the campaign against Midian, avenging what they had done to Yisrael. Or no, maybe the act of slaying the Midianite was also a necessary act in actually just stopping Klal Yisrael, bringing Klal Yisrael, taking them out of this sinful activity. Two ways perhaps of looking at it. One might say it depends on the following. What was the spiritual level of Klal Yisrael? What were they holding? If Klal Yisrael were essentially holding in an elevated spiritual level, but they had suffered an unfortunate decline through circumstances, whatever, they had been lazy, they had not been vigilant, sufficiently spiritually vigilant, and therefore this had enabled them to sin. However, once they were brought back to the senses, perhaps it would have been sufficient just to have slain Zimri. That would have brought Klal Yisrael back to the senses, in which case Klal Yisrael no longer would be engaged in any way whatsoever, would not be identifying with this sinful spiritual activity. And therefore, one might say, according to that view, the subsequent act of slaying Cosby was actually the initiation of a new campaign of avenging against Midian. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it was saying, no, Klal Yisrael themselves had descended to such a debased spiritual level, the natural fact, just slaying of Zimri himself would not have been sufficient to deter Am Yisrael from their sinful activity. And since there was still a Midianite woman around, Klal Yisrael might nevertheless have still been allured by these impure temptations, and therefore it was necessary actually to slay Cosby as just part of the basic helping Klal Yisrael to refrain from sin. If you view Klal Yisrael as having more fundamental, as having descended to greater spiritual depths. Maybe we've often spoken about this, sort of debate this question, what is the fundamental spiritual level of Yisrael? One can say this explains the two answers perhaps in Rashi. That's really what Rashi is debating. First answer says that Pinchas went to, he was the one chosen to wage this war because he is the one that started the war against Midian in slaying of Cosby. That takes the view, that answer in Rashi takes the view that in actual fact, by slaying Zimri, Pinchas had stopped Klal Yisrael, had saved Klal Yisrael. Now they are no longer the shock and whatever, the seeing that one of Yisrael has been slain for the sinful activity, that was sufficient to bring Klal Yisrael to the spiritual senses. They're no longer going to be engaged in this sinful activity. In which case, the slaying of Cosby was another act, was a new campaign of avenging Yisrael against Midian. In which case, Pinchas having started that campaign, he was the one to continue it. That's the first answer in Rashi. The second answer in Rashi was, Pinchas' act against Cosby, slaying Cosby, was a necessary adjunct to helping Klal Yisrael to refrain from sin. They were so engrossed in sin, the spiritual level was not sufficiently that just slaying of Zimri himself would have caused Klal Yisrael to desist from sinful activity. Therefore, slaying of Cosby was also part of this. It was not part of the campaign. So why then was Pinchas chosen for this spiritual mission, says Rashi? Because he was avenging what happened to Yosef. Now we can understand what happened to Yosef. The Midyanim sold him to Mitzrayim. And what's the revenge here? So one can say the revenge is, if we're understanding revenge on a slightly deeper level, the way we've explained here. So what does revenge mean? Revenge means when one suffers a fall, one has to reassert oneself. So on a spiritual level as well, this was what Pinchas was doing. In some ways, Yosef had suffered a spiritual fall. Why? When the Midyanim had sold him to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, which was the center of spiritual impurity, that obviously perhaps had a negative impact on Yosef's spiritual level. And that perhaps had transmitted itself through generations even down to Pinchas. And therefore Pinchas, now coming to avenge that, was, so to speak, coming to reassert and re-achieve the spiritual heights that were appropriate of him. And that was why he was conducting this campaign. Because this answer takes the view that, in actual fact, the spiritual level fundamental of Yisrael is always one of it's not completely stable. There's always a risk of it being compromised. And therefore, Yosef, in having been sold, this takes the view that this act of selling Yosef by the Midyanim to Mitzrayim was itself a spiritual act of aggression. It was something that would likely ensure, that would likely cause to Yosef would ensue a spiritual decline. Because Klal Yisrael themselves are always, despite their best efforts, there is always a spiritual risk in this world. It's an intrinsic part of this spiritual world, this material world. And therefore, having sold Klal Yisrael, having sold Yosef to the Mitzrayim, the Midyanim were guilty of spiritual homicide against Yosef, and Pinchas therefore had to, so to speak, come and reassert the spiritual status. Whereas the first answer in Rashi learns that no, Klal Yisrael were fundamentally on an elevated spiritual level. In which case, having sold Yosef into slavery, into Mitzrayim, that was not necessarily an act of spiritual homicide, because Yosef, we would expect, as actually transpired, was equal to the spiritual challenges and actually did not suffer ultimately, and perhaps even gained through his spiritual fortification. Therefore, it was not necessary to an act of spiritual revenge in this case. So why then was Pinchas sent? That's the first answer, Rashi. Because Pinchas now had started the campaign against Midian. Having killed the Zimri, he had caused Klal Yisrael to desist from the sinful activity, and now, killed Cosby was the start of the spiritual revenge against Midian. That's according to Rashi. Tosfos, we said, asked the same question. Why did Moshe go? Why did Moshe not go? Why did he send Pinchas? And Tosfos, somewhat interestingly, somewhat mysteriously, says that Moshe Rabbeinu owed a debt of gratitude to Midian, since they had harbored him and saved him there when he was fleeing from Pari. We asked, how could that justify how could that create a debt of gratitude in the face of what Midian had perpetrated against Yisrael, of whom Moshe was the spiritual mentor. These were the spiritual children of Moshe. So would that in any way excuse the fact that they had harbored, they had brought Moshe Rabbeinu in and looked after him? Was that in any way justification for what they'd done? Would that in any way excuse them even from Moshe for what was due to them? So we could say one of two answers, I suggest. One of two answers why Moshe Rabbeinu did not do it. The first answer would be, when you're speaking legally and morally, absolutely. Moshe Rabbeinu does not, any debt of gratitude which Moshe Rabbeinu may have owed to Midian for the benefit they had derived from them in their hospitality in the face of fleeing from Paroi, was instantly negated through their murderous and immoral conduct the Midian perpetrated against Klal Yisrael. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu would be fully entitled morally and legally to wage war himself against Midian, despite perhaps having benefited from them. That would in no way counteract one the other. Nevertheless, Moshe Rabbeinu said, this is an act of nekama, and we explained nekama means spiritual revenge, which also means spiritual revival, or spiritual resuscitation, spiritual reincarnation. Klal Yisrael are sort of revitalizing their spiritual level that they lost, and part of the way of doing that was to actually perpetrate a war against Midian. Midian had, so to speak, tried to befriend them, had tried to entice them over to their spiritual values, and Klal Yisrael, necessary to divorce themselves completely from that, had to actually wage a war against them. Says Moshe Rabbeinu, yes, I also am perfectly entitled and would wish to take a part in this war. However, vital to this war being successful is that it has to be waged with complete integrity, with complete enthusiasm, completely unwavering. Says Moshe Rabbeinu, it's impossible that I will not be ever so slightly affected. I will only be able to wage this war with a 99.9% enthusiasm. There will be a 0.1% within me of gratitude that I will be unable to cover up. I'll be unable to hide. Will always express itself in some small way in this battle I'll be waging against Midian. And that is not sufficient for Klal Yisrael. There has to be an out and right rejection by Klal Yisrael of Midian in the form of fighting against them, and says Moshe Rabbeinu, I am not the one that's appropriate. It's not appropriate for me to be the one to wage that unflinching war against Midian. Therefore, Pinchas, on the contrary, is the one who is the most appropriate to be waging this war. Another answer one might suggest is sort of illegal. The Moshe Rabbeinu, why did he run to Midian? Explain, why did Moshe Rabbeinu run to Midian when it's fleeing from Paroi? And why did he marry a Midianite without really the appropriate conduct from Moshe Rabbeinu? When Klal Yisrael are themselves suffering at the hands of Mitzrayim, they're in the concentration camps, they're perishing, they're being abused, they're being slain, murdered, enslaved. And Moshe Rabbeinu runs away, okay. He tried to stick up for them, but now he's not been successful. He's had to run away. So now he'll go back. He'll flee to America and he'll set up a family and worry about himself. Is that really appropriate? So one could suggest, no, that wasn't what Moshe Rabbeinu was doing. Moshe Rabbeinu was hiding from Paroi, and the only way possible, because Paroi himself realized that Moshe Rabbeinu, as the savior of Yisrael, was not just a great general, perhaps, or a great logistical operator that would help Klal Yisrael to escape from Mitzrayim. He was the Veishlach Malach. He was the angel, the spiritual mentor, the spiritual redeemer of Klal Yisrael. And that would be the basis for Moshe Rabbeinu's redemption of Klal Yisrael. That was what Paroi was seeking to annihilate in Moshe Rabbeinu. Because the war that Mitzrayim were waging against Yisrael was also a spiritual one. They're trying to spiritually enslave them to the values of Mitzrayim. And Moshe Rabbeinu, therefore, had no choice but to flee to Midian. Says Moshe Rabbeinu, where am I going to hide? The only place that Paroi perhaps might not find me, he might not believe that I am hiding, is in Midian. If I run to Midian, if I perhaps embrace Midian, if I sort of integrate into Midian to a certain extent, then Paroi will conclude Moshe Rabbeinu cannot be here. Because this will compromise Moshe Rabbeinu's spiritual status, he will no longer be capable of redeeming Klal Yisrael. In which case, I do not even perhaps need to find him. And especially if Moshe Rabbeinu is integrated and is married to Midianites, as Paroi, Moshe Rabbeinu is no longer a threat. Therefore, or he does not expect to find Moshe Rabbeinu here, will not see him, or maybe on a simple level, yes, he sees Moshe Rabbeinu, but this is not the Moshe Rabbeinu that's going to be the redeemer of Klal Yisrael. This is the Moshe Rabbeinu of a compromised spiritual level. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu had no choice but to hide in this spiritually compromised Midianic society in order to evade Paroi. Therefore, says Moshe Rabbeinu, on the contrary, that perhaps is the reason why I cannot fight against Midian now. Because, yes, Midian came and with their spiritual impurity and enticed Klal Yisrael and caused them to sin. However, it would be inappropriate for me sort of to take revenge against that spiritual impurity, which this war is about against Midian, because it was actual fact, that spiritual impurity that was actually my savior. Were it not for this compromised level of this society, this Midianic promiscuous society, had that not existed, I would not have been saved today. I would not be around today. And therefore, for that reason, perhaps it would not be appropriate as Moshe for me to be the one to perpetrate this revenge. And we saw Rashi brings, why was the war waged solely against Midian? Why not against Moav as well? And Rashi brought two reasons why Moav themselves were not the object of this war. A, because there was perhaps some justification for Moav having attacked and enticed Klal Yisrael, because they had grounds to fear. Because Klal Yisrael were about perhaps to attack, not directly, but maybe to overtake, or in some way to subsume Moav, and they were a genuine threat to Moav, in which case Moav were entitled somewhat to have taken evasive action. Therefore, they were not to be fought against by Klal Yisrael, whereas Midian were themselves not under serious threat, and therefore, in attacking Israel, they had sort of entered into a war that was not really appropriate for them, and therefore they ought to be attacked and taken revenge against. Second answer, says Rashi, why was Moav not an object of this war, subject of this war? Because, in actual fact, Moav had redeeming grace. That ultimately Ruth, Moavio, is going to descend out of Moav, and therefore these shtei preides toivois, Rus and Naamo, who are going to emanate from Moav, and therefore that will be sufficient to save Moav. And one might ask, what sort of ground is that? Just because in the future they're going to have an emissary in the form of Rus and Tzadikis, is that sufficient to excuse them for what they did against Klal Yisrael? It's not perhaps really understood. So I might say the following. What are the two answers in Rashi? One is because Moav had an excuse, and one is perhaps no, they didn't have an excuse. But since Rus is going to emanate from them, therefore we're not going to attack them, even though we ought to. So you could say like this: there are actually two grounds for this battle against Midian and Moav. The Pasuk itself says, "Soreres HaMidyanim," you have to create an enemy of Midian for what they've done to you. Why? Because they have afflicted you. They are fighting you. In what? Says the Pasuk in Pinchas, two things. What they did to Pa'oyer, and also what they did in Cosby. There were two things. They made you sin with idol worship, and they made you sin, which brought about the plague, and they made you sin with promiscuous adultery. Two things. So maybe Rashi is saying, what were the actual grounds for this war? Was it the idolatry, or was it the promiscuous? So I might say these are two answers in Rashi. The first answer is that it was for the idolatry which led to a plague, perhaps. If it's idolatry which led to a plague, then maybe Moav was in some ways to be excused to that, because they were themselves threatened. Second answer, says Rashi, no, it wasn't because they had an excuse, but because, on the contrary, because Rus was going to emanate from them. So perhaps Rashi means like this. So this answer holds that the primary grounds for this war was not even so much revenge, but, as we say, because Klal Yisrael themselves had sinned as a result, and therefore they had to revitalize themselves spiritually for the spiritual injury that had been inflicted upon them from Moav. They had sinned with adultery, adultery, promiscuousness. So maybe on that grounds, Moav was not guilty, not culpable. Why? Because Ruth is going to emanate from them. Maybe Rashi is saying like this, and everyone's explained this in the Gemara, we're not going to go into it now, that in actual fact, Moav had come and enticed Yisrael, the Benois Moav. It was actual fact a premonition. It was an anticipation. They realized that in the future, Moav is actually going to be very strongly united with Yisrael. They're going to be marrying into Yisrael in a pure, beneficial, appropriate manner. in the form of Rusa Mayavia, and perhaps thereafter also righteous Moabite women would be entering into Klal Yisrael. And it was perhaps in an inappropriate manner and in an inappropriate time that Moav had sort of enticed Klal Yisrael. But it was actually founded on this premonition, this appropriate spiritual premonition that they were going to be actually forming a part of Klal Yisrael. They had perhaps sought to unite themselves through his inappropriate behavior through Klal Yisrael this time. But since that was perhaps the underlying motivation of Moav, says Rashi, maybe that would be sufficient to excuse them, and they would be pardoned, and the war would not be it would not be directly directed against Moav. And we saw that Pinchas, in conducting the war, he took the holy implements, the Oroin and the Tzitz, and according to Rashi, what happened? Pinchas, when Bilam was somehow able to magically make himself to fly, when he saw Pinchas chasing after him, he said some unholy, through witchcraft, he was able to make himself fly, and Pinchas showed him the tzitz, the holy headplate with the holy name on it, engraved on it, and he thereby fell down. One could say like this, that how was it that Bilam was what was the dynamic going on there? How was Bilam actually able to make himself fly? What was the strength he had? So one could say, saying unholy names gives him the ability to fly. Perhaps it's actually an act of artificial spirituality. That's really what it is. It means, that's what the impure occult perhaps seeks to do. It seeks to enable a person to reach spiritual heights, but in an artificial manner, without actually going through the hard spiritual work of improving oneself, of controlling oneself, of even depriving oneself in the material world. They sort of seek to have all the enjoyments, all the illicit enjoyments of this world, but still to achieve spiritual heights through these impure methods. There are these impure forces that somehow themselves are spiritual beings, are operating on a high spiritual level, but really they're attached to the impurity as well. And Pinchas and Bilam was perhaps, that's what he's doing. He's saying the names of these impure forces and is able to achieve a quick high, a quick spiritual artificial high. And that's what Pinchas comes along. And Pinchas comes along and says, okay, you think you're flying high, but he shows him the holy headplate that has the name of Hashem engraved on it. So as to say, so to speak, your spiritual level is like a one-off spiritual high. Our spiritual level is ingrained, is ingrained on us, because our whole being is elevated spiritual being. It's through our hard work, through our whole essence, our whole life is devoted to this spiritual work. In which case, compared to you, when you see us, that actually amplifies, exemplifies, brings out the fact that in actual fact your spiritual level is worth nothing. It's going to fall down in 1 second. It's not a spiritual level that can be maintained whatsoever, whereas ours is one that essentially can be maintained. And therefore, when being exposed, Bilam to expose to what Pinchas represented in terms of holiness and spirituality, the contrast was such that Bilam is actually not able to fly spiritually whatsoever, even for a minute, and therefore he came crashing down. And Rashi brings, we saw that he slew the Chameshes Malchei Midian, the 5 kings. And Rashi asked, why do we need to be told they're 5? The Pasuk lists who they were. Evi, Rechem, Tzur, Chor, Reva, 5 kings of Midian. Why do we need to be told that they are 5? And Rashi told us, to tell us that they were all equal in the plot against Yisrael. And then Rashi went on to tell us that Bilam was also killed by the sword in this instance. And Bilam, what was he doing there? He went to collect his reward for the 24,000 that he had successfully brought about the death of 24,000 from Yisrael through his counsel, his evil counsel to make Yisrael sin, and therefore he's going to get reward for that. And Yisrael, he came to Yisrael and gave them a counsel. He said to them, this is not a very good idea of yours to engage in war against Midian, because when you were 600,000, you were unsuccessful. That's that seems to be in resisting the temptation of Bnei Midian, and therefore also in this war, you're only 12,000. An army of 12,000, you're not going to be successful. Klal Yisrael gave him his full reward. So we said, what's Rashi saying? One could say like this: It's actually talking about the spiritual resuscitation, revival of Klal Yisrael. Chameshes Malchei Midian. It needed the forces of the 5 kings of Midian, and one was greater than the other. They weren't all equal, but in this campaign against Yisrael, they were all absolutely equal. Now, what does that mean? They're all absolutely equal. We know that Balak was the greatest of them. So they weren't all equal, and one can never be equal. One can never be precisely the same as someone else in any joint venture. There's always someone who wields more influence and carries greater weight. So what's Rashi saying? That they were all equal. Perhaps saying like this: essentially, if we take the notion that Klal Yisrael were essentially not spiritually compromised whatsoever, they were essentially completely equal to the challenges of Midian. They had fallen, they had perhaps fallen. Now they were spiritually reasserting themselves. In which case, essentially, it was not really possible whatsoever for the efforts of the spiritually impure efforts of Midian to have thwarted Yisrael whatsoever. The only way they might have done it was with the combined forces of all the 5 kings, bringing all their spiritual counterweight against Yisrael, and perhaps they might have then been successful. In which case, all 5 are equal. Why? Because if you have any combination of any 4, it's worth nothing. They have zero spiritual power whatsoever against Yisrael. Therefore, every single one of the 5 kings is a complete, absolute necessity in having any hope whatsoever of waging any war against Yisrael, in which case they're all absolutely equal, because without the 4, they're all nothing. In which case, all 5 are absolutely equal. They're all absolutely integral to this effort, this negative effort. That's what Rashi is saying in the first place. And then what he's saying, Bilam goes and gives advice to Yisrael. The advice was perhaps like this. He seems to be comparing apples and oranges. You were unable to resist the temptation when you were 600,000. Now you're not going to be able to defeat them in war. They were saying, no, the war is a spiritual war. This war that Klal Yisrael are conducting against Midian is in actual fact a spiritual revival. And this is what Bilam was trying to say. That I have actually been successful against Yisrael. I need to be rewarded for the 24,000 that fell in the plague, because that represents a chip in the spiritual armor of Klal Yisrael. First of all, 24,000 of them have sinned. That represents a serious spiritual injury to Klal Yisrael. They're now on the lower spiritual level, and therefore they're more susceptible on all levels. And also now perhaps it's the 600,000 of Klal Yisrael, which represents the spiritual force. It's only when they're one nation with the full spiritual vigor that is represented by the 600,000 of Yisrael, the Tziva is Hashem, the army of Hashem, that's what gives them the spiritual power. And therefore Bilam suggests to Yisrael, even when you're at your spiritual zenith with all 600,000 of you, you're unable to resist the spiritual challenges of Midian. Therefore now you're going to fight this war, which essentially is a spiritual war, a spiritual revenge against Midian. Only with 10,000 of you, you're also certainly not going to be successful. And I recall actually says that in actual fact Klal Yisrael were actually, there was 24,000 who were part of the war effort. I think there were 12,000 who were directly fighting, and the 12,000 who stayed back and who were looking after the vessels and who were praying. And this perhaps corresponds to the 24,000 that had fallen, that represented the spiritual falling of Yisrael, and therefore they were resurrecting themselves as 24,000 spiritually capable individuals of Klal Yisrael. And so Klal Yisrael gave Bilam his full reward. And that is, what did? They completely took revenge on him and slayed him. And Rashi brought Bechorev by the sword, meaning what by the sword? That Rashi explained that they swapped. Bilam came at Yisrael using the power of the mouth. Yisrael's power is that of prayer, and Yisrael, which is not through the sword. And Bilam sought to attack Yisrael using their very own weapons of war themselves, by issuing a curse against Yisrael, and therefore Yisrael, by the same token, took revenge against Bilam with the sword, which was the instrument by which the nations of the world perhaps thrive. And we ask, what does that mean? We could say like this: this is part of this cosmic battle in this world for supremacy, spiritual supremacy. What is the fundamental force that informs this world? And the Klal Yisrael represent the spiritual force. We do not seek to thrive and survive on the sword through our physical efforts of doing things, but rather through our spiritual efforts, as represented by prayer, through our mouth, through what we say. And Bilam was attacking that. And he's saying, I'm taking that spiritual weapon. Meaning to say like this, Bilam is actually attacking the whole fundamental spiritual infrastructure and basis of Klal Yisrael in this world. You, Klal Yisrael, seek to assert that this is a world, as far as you're concerned, a spiritual world, in which the spirituality is the predominant force. I'm challenging that. You think that you yourselves have adopted the power of, have embraced the power of prayer, the power of rejecting the sword so wholeheartedly, so to such an extent that it resides with you in an uncompromised manner. You, so to speak, hold the power of prayer. You've completely identified with it, and have rejected as the primary medium of action the sword. It's a secondary medium. The primary medium for you is the power of prayer, and you're so wholeheartedly invested in it that, so to speak, it can never be taken away, can never be used by anyone else. It resides completely with you. And Bilam is coming to say, no, you yourselves, Yisrael, are also essentially spiritually compromised. You also live in a material world, and you cannot seek to say that our whole lives are really based on prayer, on learning Torah, on spiritual pursuits. Yes, you do engage in spiritual pursuits, but you cannot say that is your whole identity. And there will be times in which you will not be engaged completely in spiritual pursuits, and you'll be pursuing material temptations, in which case that power of prayer, which, so to speak, hovers and resides in the world, is in certain occasions not going to be vested with Yisrael. It's a power that's there, people can use it, but no one can really seek to say, I really live by prayer. And therefore, says Bilam, the power of prayer is actually available for everyone. Klal Yisrael cannot seek to say we have a monopoly on this, because you yourselves, Klal Yisrael, do not really live and thrive on it to that extent. And therefore, I'm taking the power of prayer. I'm taking that power and I'm using it for my own devices to issue a curse against you. And Klal Yisrael, seeking now again spiritual revival and resuscitation, are coming to say, no, we view this world as fundamentally spiritual one, and we live that life. And for us, we are wholly and completely invested in the power of prayer and spiritual pursuits, not through material, through the sword, as represented by the sword. And on the contrary, for us, this world, the world of the sword, is really a temporary world. It's not the true world. Scientific innovation and military prowess, etc., are not the true tools through which this world is run, and through which man ought to be toiling and investing all his energies and endeavors. On the contrary, spiritual pursuits ought to be. And those other pursuits, the sword, so to speak, is secondary, should always be secondary to spiritual pursuits. And therefore, on the contrary, even the nations one day, they're going to fall, they're going to either have to embrace our spiritual ideals and notions, or they're going to cease to really have a place in this world. And therefore, this sword, which is their sort of flagship, is ultimately not going to be something they can really say, this is ours for keeps, this is how we live, this is fully invested with us. No, one day this is going to leave you, because this is not really the true way, the true ideal. And therefore, Klal Yisrael said, on the contrary, we are able, in actual fact, to take away your sword from you and to slay Bilam through his sword. And we mentioned the Rosh, who said that Bilam was killed by the sword and also by the stone. He explained that Bilam who was Lavan, had traversed the pile of stones that Yaakov and Lavan had made a pact on, that neither would seek to in any way attack the other, and neither would traverse this border with any malevolent intention. And Bilam had reneged on that covenant, and therefore was liable, and it was killed, and his punishment was already initiated through the wall, through the stones of the wall, that his leg was compressed by the donkey. Why? Says Rashi, because this is really an example of Yad Ha'ed in the hand of the witnesses being the first to initiate, to execute the punishment. And what's the significance of the witnesses being the ones to initiate the punishment? Because if a person sees somebody perpetrating a capital crime, so there's a law, there's a due process, there's a legal process. You have to bring them to court, to Beis Din, you have to testify, the judges have to fully examine the case, and ultimately then they will issue their judgment. Yes, the person is guilty, he is to be stoned. And the witnesses sure are the ones to stone him initially. One might say, I always understood this to be partly not just to test their integrity and their genuine belief, but also on the contrary. Yes, we had to go through the due process, but essentially, the act that Reuven perpetrated in front of these Eidim was such a heinous act, this capital crime, that it was deserving essentially of being punished, of being stoned on the spot. Anyone who would see that, those witnesses who would perceive what's being done here, would be so outraged essentially, their moral integrity would be so offended that they would seek instantly to kill and stone this person, because his act is so defiant of the fundamental laws of decency and of this world, the way it's run. He has no entitlement to live even for one more second. That is why the Eidim, the witnesses, are actually the ones to initiate the stoning, is making a statement, so to speak, that this act really is an act that has no, you instantly forfeited, the perpetrator of this crime instantly forfeited any subsequent right to life whatsoever. Maybe this is what is being said here, that Bilam, the pact that he made with Yaakov, wasn't just a pact that we will not attack one another. It actually created, as far as Yaakov is concerned, it created sort of a new cosmic order. That Yisrael has, in the form of Yaakov, has a spiritual entitlement in this world, and Bilam has no right whatsoever to trespass on that, to interfere with that. And in interfering with that, he's actually interfering almost with the fundamental laws of nature of this world, which is you don't attack Yisrael. Therefore, in seeking, even just initiating his plan and traveling towards Yaakov with this evil intention, he has forfeited his life and he's forfeited any right whatsoever to exist in this world, because the dominant Yisrael, the spiritual place of Yisrael in this world, essentially was defined as being so integral to this world that anyone who seeks to attack that and to undermine that is really, like we said, contravening the laws of nature and has no entitlement whatsoever to life itself. And we saw also in the context of Bilam, the interesting Targum Yonason that brought the dialogue between Bilam and Pinchas. When Bilam was fleeing from Pinchas, he said an impure witchcraft name from his sorcery and was able to float in the air. And Pinchas said the holy name and was able to float in the air. And Pinchas apprehended Bilam, withdrew his sword, threatened to kill him, and Bilam begged for mercy. And Pinchas rejected his plea. Bilam said, from now on I'm never going to curse Yisrael, I'm going to be a good boy. And Pinchas rejected this based on Bilam's history, his repeated criminal record, his repeated transgressions against Yisrael. At the time of Yaakov, at the time of Parai, he had recommended slavery, he had sought to destroy them in Mitzrayim, he had sought to wage war through Amalek against them, then he had sought to curse them, and then he had sought to make them sin. Says Bilam, says Pinchas, you are a hopeless villain who seeks only the evil for Yisrael. Therefore, I have no choice but to slay you. And we asked, why is Pinchas even engaged in any discussion whatsoever in the matter against Bilam? Bilam is a sinner, and how can you expect to believe him whatsoever just because he's pleading for mercy here? So we said, perhaps you could suggest like this, and we're going to see this actually, you saw it further on in the Parsha. Therefore, hopefully we'll hear these pieces and this piece and connect them up. That the principle perhaps is like this. Once Pinchas has caught up with Bilam, and Pinchas himself is completely pure, completely committed and dedicated to this spiritual mission of avenging Klal Yisrael. Pinchas has no inhibitions, no aversions whatsoever, even to spilling blood of Yisrael. And therefore Pinchas can be completely trusted that he is going to conduct this war unflinchingly, uncompromisingly. In which case, as soon as he meets up with Bilam and withdraws his sword, essentially Bilam is finished. Actually, Bilam is, so to speak, being murdered. He's been killed. And if Pinchas will allow Bilam, so to speak, grant him life, the air grants to believe that yes, Bilam will be a renewed, improved Bilam. Why? Because essentially it is a new Bilam. Bilam essentially has been slain through the potential act of Pinchas is such potency that actually itself sort of kills Bilam. And if Bilam undertakes that he will be a new person, a new, improved, and having expressed total contrition and regret for what he's done. Therefore, in granting him life, it's granting him like a new life based on the new principles that Bilam undertakes to abide by. And therefore, perhaps there were potential grounds, says Pinchas even, to expect Bilam to be a renewed Bilam. It's a rebirth. The Bilam is a new person. But Pinchas says, no, there's no way this can be allowed, because on the contrary, you have perpetrated so many acts, and essentially, in terms of each act you did against Yisrael, you ought to have forfeited your life. And you have no right whatsoever to life. And nevertheless, again and again, you repeated your heinous acts, in which case, even if I grant you mercy, grant you clemency, somehow on this occasion, this will be to no avail, I am certain that you will continue maintaining your heinous and evil intents, because, as you've proved until now, you are an implacable sinner. Therefore, says Pinchas, that's why Bilam has to be uncompromisingly given his capital punishment. And finally, we asked, what is the connection at the beginning of the Parsha? Why do you have the beginning of the Parsha? The beginning of the Parsha is all about a man taking a vow. He's obliged to live up to his vow. And we said, what is this doing here at all? They asked, where does this come from? Who told Moshe about this vows? And we said this is a continuation of the Parsha of the portion dealing with the sacrifices. And since Yisrael brings sacrifices, they also, in a similar way, they undertake vows of self-control, self-denial. And similarly, women also take vows. But we asked, nevertheless, why is in that case these laws not appended to the portion of Pinchas? Is it because Pinchas is too long? That's reason to make a break. MATOS MASEH is also very long. I had to lane half of it this Shabbos. It took a lot of energy. It would have been easier for me had it been in last week's Parsha, where someone else did the laning. And also, we asked, what about the women? Why did the fact of women making Nedarim, why does that appear here? And all the laws of men annulling the vows of women. So one could say, and what's this got to do with this context here? Of, in the beginning of Matos, which really deals with the battle against Midian and these events. It would be far more appropriate to have this portion placed in Pinchas, dealing with the laws of sacrifices and self-denial and vows. But one could say, no, this is actually an adjunct to this precedes appropriately the war against Midian. Why? Because one could say that essentially, like we explained, the war against Midian was a spiritual war. And it was because Midian had enticed Klal Yisrael. And therefore, the Torah perhaps is telling us, before Klal Yisrael wage war against Midian, it has to be with certainty that there's going to be spiritual temptations. There's going to be room again for a spiritual fall on Klal Yisrael. In which case, Klal Yisrael have to make sure that they are spiritually fortified, that they are spiritually sound, that they will not be drawn away and enticed by the Midianite women, as had previously occurred. And even if you're going into battle against them, there's always a danger that the enemy will actually seek to entice the other opposing side through these women, enticing them, which will maybe inhibit their will to fight. So therefore, Klal Yisrael, as we're engaging in a spiritual preparation. And what's a spiritual preparation for fighting against these temptations? Is one has to fortify the Jewish home. If one's Jewish home is completely fortified, then one can go out. Perhaps one should not seek temptation, but even if one is inevitably confronted with it, one is perhaps more spiritually able to deal with this. And this perhaps is what is happening here. Because what is the whole idea, first of all, of men being entitled to annul the vows of women? And I think the rationale behind it is this rationale. A woman takes a vow. Essentially, we're not talking about any vow. Most of the vows that entitle her husband to renege her vow, to annul her vows, are those vows of self-denial of the women which affect perhaps the attraction, perhaps the optimism, perhaps the happiness of the woman, of the wife. And if the wife is unhappy, if the wife is unattractive, this is going to impact negatively perhaps on the marriage. If the husband decides, sometimes the husband will say, yeah, this is appropriate, but he has the option of saying, this for me is not appropriate behavior. If my wife is not happy, if she's not attractive, then this perhaps for the husband is a distraction, is a problem, and maybe he is more likely to be tempted by the attractions that exist out with the holiness of the home. And therefore the Torah says it is the entitlement of the husband to annul those vows of the woman in the interest of preserving the holiness of the holy bond between husband and wife, particularly in the context of the husband going out and perhaps being tempted by other temptations outside the house. And therefore we have this parsha which says the husband is entitled to renege, to nullify all those vows of their wives, to ensure that the happiness of the home, the integrity of the holy home is maintained. However, one might say that is very good when we're applying to the vows of a married woman. What about a woman who's not married, who is single and is in her father's house? It's her father who nullifies the vows, not the husband. I might say yes, but essentially it's all part of the same dynamic, the same regime. Because the entitlement of the father, essentially the father has another entitlement. The father is entitled to marry his daughter off to a husband. And when she marries the husband, he will be entitled to nullify her vows. And one might say, one has to check the Gemara's Nedarim, which way it works. But essentially that is this dynamic to the father, and almost in anticipation. Yes, when you get married, my daughter, and you're going to make this vow, this is something that is likely to be unattractive for a husband, in which case I'm saying this is not how I'm going to be able to marry you off. I want to marry you off into a complete, harmonious, integrated marriage, in which case I therefore am nullifying these vows already now. And what they're saying is really part of a greater statement. That this entitlement, this is saying something about the relationship, that essentially the relationship, the bond that exists between the husband and the wife, essentially is a bond that the whole essence of it is one of creating family purity. And therefore the wife, so to speak, we're told she makes this vow reliant in anticipation on what and subordinate to what her husband's wishes will ultimately be. And she sort of says to herself, if he will deem this inappropriate, then I accept that. And that is the sort of the legal rationale basis for the vow being nullified, which is really saying part of this statement that essentially the wife, her whole being is viewed, she views it, the Torah views it as coming to create this holy unit of husband and wife, which is really what we're saying here. This is what goes together then with this reasserting ourselves against the impurity of Midian. Klal Yisrael is reasserting its spiritual fortification, which is based on the harmony in the house, and that the wife is fully aware of this, that this is her role to enhance the holiness within the house. Which is part of this greater statement that essentially Yisrael, in reasserting their spiritual status, saying Yisrael essentially is a holy nation. The whole of Yisrael is a holy nation, and the basic foundations of marriage, therefore, are based completely on these founding holy principles.